We used to live over at Marrakesh Golf Club. It shows that very well as the Living Desert, which is my present active interest, and up the canyon where the university has its research center.
I'm Bill Hesson. This is another Prickly Pears conversation with a Pioneer Palm Springs resident. Today we're going to chat with Phil Boyd, the first mayor of Palm Springs, about his memories of those wonderful days in the 20s and 30s. And Phil, it's nice of you to be with us.
Bill, I'm pleased to be here. I hope I can remember the things you want to learn.
I'm sure you will. Let's begin with the beginning and get acquainted with Phil Boyd. Where were you born, Phil, and where did you grow up?
I was born in Indiana in a small town called Richmond, near the Ohio border, and we soon moved to Indianapolis, where I lived until I came west in 1920, and then was for a year in a sanitarium trying to recover from identified tuberculosis. And a year after that experience, I was advised to come to a dry desert, so and the Thanksgiving weekend of 21 was my first appearance at Palm Springs.
You came here in 1921?
Correct.
And that was for health reasons?
It was, yes.
What did the town look like the day you arrived?
Well, I came in from the north, of course, as you would expect, over a little dirt road, having followed the instructions of several people on the way, including those in Banning, and found the gates to take me into the Desert Inn, which was a well-established, attractive, small hotel, although the development of it later became much more substantial. But as I came in, I saw a few little homes as we approached the downtown area, and then there were just a few business buildings. And frequently you would see horses going along, or Indians on the corner. The town itself was very attractive to me because I had heard about it, but couldn't imagine it.
I wanted to ask how you happened to choose Palm Springs as your destination.
Well, it was because a friend of mine had been down and spent several weekends down here. He came to see me in Los Angeles and said, "Come down and see what it's like. I want to show it to you." And I had been advised by doctors in my reading that a dry, warm climate was good for my recovery. And some people went to Arizona, and some people went to similar desert areas, but Palm Springs seemed to be close at hand, and I came down for that reason and never regretted it.
What was the trip down here like?
Well, Bill, it took 2 days for me to come down. I was in a small little car and drove out the first day to the Mission Inn in Riverside and rested up there a little and started out the next morning and came down remembering that there wasn't any freeway traffic. We were on a very winding little road that went across from Riverside over to Beaumont and into the town of Beaumont, not around Beaumont, but you'd go right through the central streets of Beaumont and Banning.
Was there a paved road through there?
There was through Beaumont and Banning, yes. And as we came through Banning, I stopped for luncheon, the San Gorgonia Inn, which is still there.
Yes.
And from there on, I was guided down by their advice and soon found Palm Springs and saw the desert for the first time. And as I have had occasion to explain, it didn't take long for me to recognize it was the right place for me to live in. I never went back for weeks and weeks to Los Angeles. I sent for my clothes and possessions that were brought down to me, and I settled in the Desert Inn for several years.
Did you stay at the Desert Inn that first night?
I stayed there the first night and stayed there until I was married in 1926.
What was the Desert Inn like then? What sort of physical situation
Well, there were a lot
was
of small sort of cabins. Didn't have any glass in the windows. There were canvas sides that came down to shut out the weather. a little wood stove, bathroom, of course. And we all walked over to the central dining room, which was a frame building. Very pleasant people making us welcome. It was owned by Mrs. Nellie Kaufman and her two sons, Earl Kaufman and George Roberson, who managed it and guided it to its growth. And many interesting people began to come. They had praise for the food and comfort and their associations. As I lived there, I made friends with leading businessmen from Los Angeles who would come out, and some people from the East who'd spend a month or two.
Had you been in business yourself before coming to the desert?
I had short business experiences. I worked in the summertime in a bank. That was my principal experience.
Mm-hmm.
I actually left to come here without finishing my college education because of my health. Later on, I went back and finished it.
Well, obviously, your health prospered.
It meant a lot to me, and it's given me a long life. I live rather cautiously even now.
Mm-hmm. But you settled down then in the Desert Inn, and that became your residence for a number of years.
And I became part of the community shortly when I was well enough. I rode horses regularly for the first few years for exercise.
Mm-hmm.
It's how I became familiar with all the canyons, like Palm Canyon and Talquitz, and out into the desert. It was a way to become familiar with the natural desert, which has always been of great interest to me.
We're going to
there were
talk
people
about
with whom I was associated who rode with me who had somewhat the same health experience. 2 or 3 men that I had a very fine, close relationship with, and we enjoyed those days very much.
I'm sure you did. Who were some of the community leaders that you remember in those first 2 or 3 years?
There's one man who isn't mentioned often enough that I praise as a very fine and important individual in the early days of Palm Springs. His name is Dr. Crocker, K-O-C-H-E-R, the only doctor in the community. His office was right across from the Desert Inn, and the rear of an adobe building. The front of the building was a little drugstore where his wife sold merchandise, drugs, and filled prescriptions. But Dr. Crocker looked after the Indians and looked after all the people who cared to have his advice. He had a Swiss background and was really a very fine man, became one of my closest friends. We later on traveled in Europe together. But he was there, and later on, I think I might add, he developed the Crocker-Sampson Insurance Agency, developed a subdivision out there near where El Mirador was, and where we built our first home. But I want to mention him because he was involved in many things, and I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but he and I had a very interesting experience one time renaming the streets of Palm Springs. We realized that the streets then were called Main Street, North Street, South Street, Spring, Orange, Lemon, which had no significant relationship with what was going on there, while the Indian names did. While we left Indian Avenue as it has always remained and should be, Main Street became Palm Canyon Drive. And then we named the streets in the mile square alphabetically, beginning with Alejo, Amado, Arenas, going all the way down to Ramon, and then going west, where you got Bristol, Belardo, Cahuilla, Lugo, and so on. Those were all Indian tribal names. Many of the Indians were there at the time. Potencio, for instance. Francisco Potencio became a very good friend of ours. At that particular date, and I wish I could tell you when, it must have been in the early 30s, Dr. Crocker had a great deal to do with it, and I worked with him, and we presented it and got the official approval, and those became the names that seemed appropriate.
So you became the street sign or street name committee.
Perhaps,
the first one.
Yeah, of course, in those days we had to get the approval of the county. We were not incorporated.
That must have been difficult. You'd have had to drive to Riverside.
Which we did frequently.
I'm sure you would have had to. Would Dr. Crocker then have been the first doctor in Palm Springs?
Yes. Dr. Florella White was a doctor, but she didn't practice there. And we knew her very, very well. There were 2 White sisters, Florella and Cornelia. They had the property over there between Palm Canyon Drive and Indian Avenue, in the trees on both sides of Talquitz McCallum, I think it was. No, in that area.
I didn't know that Farilla was a doctor.
She was a doctor.
But
She didn't practice there, but she was known as Dr. White.
well, besides Dr. Crocker, who else were good friends of yours in those days?
Well, there were so many. Stephen Willard, and I point to the picture that he made, was an outstanding photographer and artist. You've heard of him, I hope. He created a very interesting and large photograph and then would color it in such a way that it looked like an oil painting. And that particular framed picture is just about the spot where this building is now.
Isn't that right?
I mentioned that. Steve and his wife we knew quite well. Stephen Willard, Dr. Crocker and his wife, Carl Licken and his wife, Herb Sampson. There were a number of names that belonged in that period. And of course, the Kaufmans we knew quite well, and we knew the McCallum family quite well.
You must have become a pretty good friend of Nellie Kaufman's.
Quite.
You stayed at her
When we
hotel
got
for so
married,
long.
she asked us to be married in her home.
Oh.
We
And
were
I'll bet you
married
called
in her home at the Desert Inn.
I'll bet you called her Mother Kaufman,
We did.
along with everyone else. What kind of a woman was she?
Well, she was a very conscientious person and very busy all the time looking after her affairs there. I don't know how to describe her except you couldn't help but praise her for being a remarkable woman. There have been stories written about her. She attracted the confidence of many civic leaders throughout the Southern California area. I would say outstanding among them would be Tom O'Donnell, who loaned the money that created the major improvements there, the main building as it was built a little later. But there were many others. As I have mentioned in some of my remarks, King Gillette, for instance, of the Gillette Safety Razor, was frequently a member there. A.P. Giannini and his son, coming down from San Francisco.
The founder of Bank of America.
Founder of the Bank of Italy, which became the Bank of America.
Became the Bank of America.
And the story is told of his son who helped to start the first Bank of America in Palm Springs.
I want to hear that story. What was the business community like in for the first 2 or 3 years you were here?
Well, as I recall, Carl Licken's store was a little hardware store in which the post office was in the back, and that was right next to the Crocker building. And beyond that, there were 1 or 2 little restaurant places which were on both sides of the street. It was soon after they started another little drugstore. The business community wasn't very large, but they were beginning to be, soon after I got there, and actively under construction in the late 20s, a number of other little apartment houses and hotels, like Del Tocquitz, where they expanded the Oasis Hotel, which was part of the McManus property, as you probably know. And the homes which were started were somewhat the development of Alva Hicks. You must remember that name. Alva Hicks started the water district down there. His son and grandson were well known. Harold and Jim is there now in the real estate business. Harold, Alva Hicks was a remarkably fine man.
Alva Hicks, as you pointed out, started the water company, but another in that family, I think, started the Desert Golf Classic. That would have been...
That was Milton.
That was Milton Hicks.
Yeah, Milton was Harold's brother.
An interesting family. What were your first business involvements in the community?
Well, I think I really got started, Bill, as a member of the Chamber of Commerce and the secretary of the Chamber of Commerce in Palm Springs. The Chamber of Commerce was an unusual organization. It was not entirely involved in bringing business interests in. It represented the homeowners too. It had sort of a homeowners division. They wanted to go to the meetings and have some influence on what was being sought for improvement. Later on, the Chamber became aware of the need of incorporation, and before that it started 3 different the fire and there were 3 different agencies that were formed before we were incorporated. One was fire, one was police, and the other was sanitation. And you elected the directors of these 3, and they functioned to raise money, which they could do in a district fashion. And we've had for a while a fire department, a police department, and sanitary collection.
Would they
before we
all
were
have been?
incorporated.
Would they all have been volunteer?
The volunteers were members of the board. You paid the force. I think that's true with police particularly. I think there were some volunteers in the fire department.
Mm.
The sanitation was done by a man with an Italian background. I can't even remember his name, but everybody knew him, and he was busy with his truck going around into everybody's driveway,
Mm-hmm.
but paid from sources of money raised through a district tax. But the time came when it was everybody's opinion that we needed incorporation. We were pretty far away from the central part of the county, Riverside. And it was then that a series of meetings occurred, and in '38 we became incorporated. And when we became incorporated, there was already one building which was built for the fire department. On the second floor was where we had our first council meeting.
Hmm. Phil, before we talk about the incorporation, let's talk a little more about the Chamber. Did the Chamber of Commerce exist when you came to Palm Springs?
I believe not.
Do you remember how it began, who the people were that were instrumental in organizing it? Some of them?
I have no way of pointing to exactly how it happened. I think a number of us would be inclined to meet occasionally and talk about the town problems. And so the need of an organization became apparent. But as I said, we always had with us homeowners too. And you'd be talking about water supply or improvement on the streets or things that were needed that we didn't have, including a bank.
That's right. You said you were secretary of the Chamber for a while, which probably meant being the general manager of the place too.
It was largely my responsibility.
Were you the first one?
I think so. There was a man by the name of Frank Shannon who came in right after me, who was very active in that capacity. I don't know whether you've come across his records or not. Frank Shannon, he died a number of years ago.
I've heard the name mentioned many times.
Yeah. I'm surprised I can dig up these names.
Was the Chamber of Commerce the unofficial city council before incorporation?
I would call it that, as nearly as you could describe it. It had no authority. As you realize, it had an ambition to be connected in some way with any of the county administration in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And so politically it became active.
At what point, Phil, did the community begin to feel the need for incorporation?
Probably about 36, 37. There was a need of some change before you could become incorporated, so you could include Indian land. And that required a action of the state legislature, which was accomplished. There was no opposition to it. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you couldn't have had the boundaries of your city include Indian sections, which it did.
You'd have had a city built like a checkerboard.
Right.
But you were able to include the Indian properties within the...
Yes, although always with questionable authority over the use of that property.
That's
and
still
the
questionable.
behavior of people on the Indian land. However, it was possible through a act of the legislature to incorporate a wide area, including Indian sections.
Do you remember some of the particular reasons that the community felt it should be incorporated? Was there a need for better police protection, for example, or...
Probably that was one of the reasons. Land use probably was another, because you know, it was wise to get professional people in to lay out the future development of streets and discuss where business districts should be and which was to be the residential area and so on. I'd say land use was another important.
How about taxes? Did you...
Well, that would, of course, be necessary to function. And the taxes that we were raising came through the three districts that I described. Mm-hmm. Fire, police, and sanitation. But that was not money available for working out a long-range plan of land use.
Was there gambling then? Would that have been a factor?
It came a little after that.
Came after that.
Well, let me put it this way. Perhaps there was some gambling then. The gambling came after the period of 32, 33, when there was a national economic situation that caused a great deal of difficulty. As a matter of fact, there were a great many failures of businesses in Palm Springs. By that I mean they were unable to pay their interest on their borrowed money, and there were foreclosures and things like that, which brought about a fear of the future. And the 1932, the Depression is a way to describe it.
That's what it was.
32, 33, there was a man who came to town who proposed to start a club and wanted the support of the community so that he could run the club the way he wanted to, which was to include gambling.
Mm-hmm.
And the club, he said, would be out in the Cathedral City area, not within the incorporated area, or the area considered Palm Springs. And the concern of the hotel owners then was so great that they asked what they could do. They didn't want to support any illegal activity. And this man, his name is Al Wertheimer, said, all I want you to do is not to complain to the county sheriff's department, the authorities, as to what we're doing. Let me handle that. And just let me, I will build a very handsome club, we'll have good food there, we'll have interesting music, and I will bring people from the east who know my activities in Detroit, who would like to come out if they know that I will provide them entertainment, and they'll fill your hotels. You will then be pulled out of this distress that you're in now. Well, this sounded like a possibility. So the 3 or 4 people who were present during that conversation said, well, let us say we won't try to interfere with what you're doing out in Cathedral City, but if your influence on our town is considered to destroy its attractive features, will you close down? He says, absolutely. You tell me, I'll close down if you don't think I've brought you prosperity and attractive new people.
I wonder if he did. Do you remember on the Committee for Incorporation, Phil, who some of the other people were that worked with you on that?
I think the chairman of the committee, as I should have mentioned before, was probably Frank Bennett. And he was associated with us in managing with his wife the Deep Well Guest Ranch, which was functioning in that period. I recall Frank Bennett's appearance presiding over a group considering and finally agreeing upon the corporation.
Mm-hmm. I think Culver Nichols might have been a member of that.
I think he very likely was.
Committee too. So you made the necessary arrangements and sort of presented the idea to the community. How was the community support for incorporation? Was there much opposition?
I don't have the exact vote, but there was no question it was very strongly in favor of incorporation when the election occurred.
We were told that Nellie Kaufman was opposing. She didn't think it needed to be.
Not to my recollection.
Your meeting, I think, the big town meeting to discuss it was held at the Francis Stevens School. Was that right?
I believe it was, yeah. We used that auditorium, as she did. That's another story, and that's a very interesting one. I won't divert you to that, but that was the beginning of the motion picture industry in the desert. Her movies, which were shown primarily at the Desert Inn, were shown a day later there to raise money to pay for extra police. And the man who showed those movies was Earl Strebe.
Mm-hmm.
Earl Strebe, and I stood at the door and collected, I think, 25 or 50 cents for everybody who came to see the movie, which had been shown the day before at the Desert Inn. And that money went into hiring some extra police.
Mm-hmm.
And Earl learned how to operate a motion picture machine, and soon started his first movie. And later on, he had 6 or 8 of them around the valley and up in the mountains and so on. It was his very successful career.
It did turn into a successful career.
But he started. Earl at that time was a bellboy or somebody at the Desert Inn. And then Mrs. Kaufman had confidence in Earl and said, well, you've operated our machine here, let's do it and make some money at the school. And that was in the little auditorium there, where the only place we went to have meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And if we had a full house, there might have been 100 people there.
You became the first mayor of Palm Springs. How did they talk you into running for the office, or was that something that you really felt was important and you wanted to do?
Well, I don't recall, except that I'd been so involved in the effort to incorporate, and several of us shared ideas, and that first city council had a number of people who wanted to work with me on it. Alva Hicks was on it, and Frank Pershing, Frank Shannon, I can't name them all. It's interesting, and probably not many people know this, that the first city council is cut in a concrete base on the outside door of the Security Bank at Ramon Road and Indian Avenue. Did you ever see that?
Yes, I have. I've gone by there many times.
Well, all right, you'll see the faces of the people who were on that first city council sitting there.
It's a little historical
Right.
obelisk, actually.
Right.
And you can see that. What were your first goals when you became organized as a city?
I get back to, I think it was land use. I think we wanted a master plan of the development of the future growing Palm Springs. And we brought a man down from Santa Barbara who was a professional. I can't give you his name immediately. I do have his first design, because I have it in my office. He came down and he laid out the streets and where the streets ought to go, where ought to be an airport, there ought to be all of these different things, and limited to business district and residential district. And it was quite interesting. After a number of hearings, we adopted that.
How
You
large?
have to have a planning commission, you know.
How large was the first city? How far did the city limits extend?
Well, his map went out as far as, I know Deepwell Ranch was on it, and you know that's out close to where you see Smoke Tree Ranch now and a number of things around the turn of Palm Canyon Drive. It went north of the El Mirador. El Mirador was built about 1927. It went a little distance north. East, out beyond, there was a small little airport before the big one was out in there. And of course to the mountainside in the west.
So you had a fairly large community. Did you begin with a city manager and staff?
We found the need of it within the first 2 years, and we employed one.
Who was your first city manager? Do you remember?
I'm afraid I can't tell you. I remember the individual, but I can't give you his name.
Where was City Hall located then?
Well, we had several locations. As I say, our first meetings were on the second floor of the fire department. And later on, we had a city offices in some buildings that were built by Dr. Crocker. We were leasing. I remember that's where my desk was and where the city clerk was and where our files were and things like that. And it was quite a while before we had a real city hall.
Do you remember when the first one came along?
I haven't any
Or
date
when
for it.
the-
No, I haven't anything here to refer to on that. I can remember it was a couple of years where we continued to use the large assembly room in the fire department. It's easy to get up there, and there's plenty of room. We just had to get some more chairs and a couple of tables.
Was there good interest in the community and what the city was doing?
I would think so,
Yeah.
yes. We had some very interesting people who were here who were successful industrialists from the East. And they took an interest, active interest. And I'm sure that although we couldn't get many of them to run for office, that they were willing to serve on committees and things like that.
You spoke of the business community a while ago and the first bank. When you came to Palm Springs, was there a bank?
No.
How did everyone manage their financial affairs?
Well, they used a bank in Riverside, and I think there was a little bank, a First National Bank in Banning, perhaps. However, they didn't loan any money up in there. The Riverside was the closest bank that had any substantial financial relationship.
You said that A.P. Giannini would come to Palm Springs. Did his interest in the area have anything to do?
I can tell you very quickly, and it had a lot to do with our first bank. First place, as the Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, hoping to have a bank, that was one of our objectives, let's get a bank. I went into Los Angeles and up to Redlands to see some of the major banks that were expanding. In Riverside, there was a Citizens National. Every one of those three banks would say, well, Palm Springs is only a 6 months activity. We'd have nothing to do in the summer. We can't start a bank in an area like that. So we were a little discouraged when one day Nellie Kaufman came to me and said, I want you to meet Mr. Giannini. And it wasn't A.P., it was his son.
Oh.
His son was not in very strong health and would come down in the wintertime every few months and stay in one of their cottages. And I went over and she introduced me to him, and I sat on the porch and chatted with him. His name was Mario. His father was AP. And Mario came in and he said, as I proposed the question, we badly needed a bank. You've got a lot of branches. Couldn't you add one and have a good branch here? And the same answer was, well, we couldn't prosper here because there wouldn't be any business for 6 months of the year. We don't build banks like. Well, I said, I think enough people are here in the summer, enough businesses to keep you open and going. He finally, after quite a conversation, said to me, I'll tell you what, if you will go to the merchants in town and get them to sign a proposal that they will put so much money in the bank and keep it there, and it will equal $100,000, we'll send down an investigation to see whether we will put a bank in. So and he said, I'm coming back next month and I'll see you. So I had a busy time talking to the merchants and got commitments, and they signed the little paper, and 3 or 4 of them went over, and we sat on the porch and talked to marriage, and then a month later I said, these are the gentlemen that I want you to meet. This is their commitment. It exceeds $100,000. Now it's your move. He said, I promise. So he said, you wait, I'll send a man down to see you. One of their people who do the investigating for an area to be served by their new branches came to see me, and we had quite a long talk. And he said, you know all these people who have committed themselves. We think you ought to be a member of the bank family. If we agree to put a bank here, will you be an assistant manager and work at the bank to be sure all of them live up to their commitments? Well, I said, I thought about it a little while. I said, I would rather be the manager of the bank, or there are other things I'd rather do. Well, he said, what do you know about managing a bank? Well, I said, I've been a teller in a little bank back east working in the summer and a bond department and so on. I said, I could give you evidence that I can learn how to operate a bank. And they said, send us those evidences. So I got some letters out of Indiana. And pretty soon they said, I'll tell you what we'll do. You can be manager, but we've got to get a man who knows how to run a branch bank in the bank. And they brought a man down from Canada. Canada then had better branch banking services than we had in the United States. I'm talking about 1928, 29. And Al Gardner was the name of that man who came down from McLeod, I think it was, a little town up in Canada. And he knew how to run a branch bank, and there were, of course, lots of instructions. There were 3 of us that ran that bank for the first year, Al and I and a teller. It wasn't too long after that that Fred Ingram came along and got under the... But the remarkable part of it, all these people, and they weren't just merchants, they were wealthy people from the East who kept an account with us. We had $1 million at the end of the first year. And they said, well, you need a new building. And that new building, I have a little picture of it across the street of the Bank of America.
Where was the first bank located?
Well, it was in Bunker's garage.
Oh.
It was in this building you see in this picture here.
Let's hold it up.
Yeah.
We wanted to take a look at this anyway.
Bunker's garage is right next to the Desert Inn. And
this is actually a painting, isn't it?
Here's where, yes, actually. Here's where Zaddy Bunker repaired cars in there.
Mm-hmm.
But when they were willing to lease it to the Bank of America, we enclosed that and got a big safe, had a door opening there. This became the Bank of America. The Desert Inn was over there.
And that's where the first branch was, the first bank,
the first
right?
year and a half until the new building was constructed.
Right in Bunker's garage.
Yeah.
And the cars in that picture are typical of the era, I suppose.
Yes, they are. That goes back into the late teens.
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful picture.
Yeah. We identify these cars as a Stutz and a Marmon and something else. And here they sold Red Crown.
They were
gasoline.
selling Red Crown gasoline.
Yeah.
I don't even remember that.
I don't know if I've interrupted you. I can show you a little picture of that first bank across the street right over here. I've got it.
Well, you want to stop for a scene? Here, let me put his microphone on. And right now we're looking at a picture of that first bank building. Now, would this have been the, after you moved out of the garage, this would have been your first location?
That's relatively across the street.
Where was this in terms of the town now?
It was right across, well, let's see. The Desert Inn has the big shopping center area there now. I'm trying to think in relation to what it would be.
Mm-hmm.
It's right across from that. Of course, none of that is there anymore.
I guess would it have...
It's between Arenas and Talkwitz on the east side of the street.
Mm-hmm. While we're looking at pictures, let's take a second and look at this one, which says 1920 and 21. And,
yes, the interesting part of it, here's Dr. Crocker walking down the street with his little satchel where he had his medication and things for calling on patients.
So that was the
doesn't mean
doctor.
much to many others, but it does to me.
And it says stage across the street. Was that a Butterfield stage stop?
Yes. Well, I think it originally was Butterfield. In those days, there were buses going through.
Mm-hmm. And down the street is a long building that I'll bet was Addie Bunker's garage. Am I right about that?
Yes. See, that's not a paved surface either.
No, that the main street, as you said it was called in those days, was a dirt road.
And it was Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
It was Main Street.
Well, that's a beautiful
It's after
picture.
that the palm trees came. Tom O'Donnell had a lot to do with adding palms to the landscaped area of the downtown and the entrance to the town.
He was one of the people who was instrumental in trying to keep it a beautiful place to
Yes,
live.
and many people will recognize the first small little golf course was his personal golf course, which he invited people to use. And his home was up on the mountain above the Desert Inn.
Mm-hmm.
You could see it up there for a number of years.
When did he build that home, do you remember?
I haven't a date for that, but here comes an answer.
1926, we heard from the Wings.
Well, 1926 would be, a better memory came from the distance there. But we all knew the O'Donnells very well, and he was very helpful in when anything was needed in the way of raising money, he was the number one to help. Like putting palm trees in or starting the little library there, the Wellwood Murray Library, we raised money for that.
Mm-hmm.
He was right there first.
You mentioned library. We have heard of a library called Eileen's Library. Do you remember such a place at all?
Honey, what about Eileen's Library?
Well, it was on the church property.
She was a
The
member of
church
the
was
board.
right on that corner.
Eileen's Library.
Eileen's Library. She was
There are some people who say we may be the first white couple who's ever been married at Palm Springs.
Well, you had to send away to get a minister to come in.
We had to bring a minister down to the city.
You were telling us about the O'Donnell house.
Well, it was under construction at the same time that the house we were building was under construction, and they were married at about that same time. So while they were almost a generation older than we always had in common the fact that we'd been married about the same time.
And Phil said you were the first white couple to be married in Palm Springs. Is that
Well, that was because you had to go to Riverside to get your marriage permit, you know, and wait 3 days. And there were not many people down in Palm Springs who wanted to go through all that.
There obviously were some marriages with the Indian families, if you follow that through. But we have the other reputation.
But Elaine's Library, you were wondering about, it was started by a little group there in Palm Springs because these two teachers, sisters, had come to, because of health problems, to the desert, and there was no place for them to get reading matter. And at the time of the death of Elaine, her sister put $200 in Oahu Sugar Company as a memorial to her sister Elaine, and hoped that a library could be started. Now, Philip's mother had something to do with this, even the year before we were married, because I remember they went to the local church, which was a mission church at that time, and asked to be permitted to, if they would be permitted to put in a small structure, just a frame, wooden type, one room, on the back corner of the church property. And the church was delighted to have that. books turned up from all directions, people who were glad to contribute. Our system, I became interested because of Philip's mother, who had poured tea at the opening tea party that was given for very few people. But I thought, well, I could certainly go down there and work out a system, knowing nothing about being a librarian, but with a card index, and all people would have to do when they came in and saw a book they wanted to take home was take out a card and sign it, and with the name and all the rest. And that's the way we functioned, with just an open door arrangement, that people could come in and get what books they wanted and sign for it. And this went on for quite a while. But it was named Elaine's Library because of the Oahu Sugar Company stock that we'd been given.
And that would have probably continued until Wellman Murray went into business.
We hoped that the city, as the library was being developed up there on the corner of Tocquet's and the main street, would name a wing or something or other for Elaine, and it was done. But then I've lost track since then of when the new building was put in out on the polo grounds.
It's hard to talk about the library without mentioning Francis Crocker, who was a board member for 41 years.
That's right. There was a branch of the library, the Crocker branch.
Right.
And of course,
And
Melba
Francis
Bennett
was
on that.
very active in the early days, so many things. And we should continue to mention Culver Nichols, who was, and his wife Sally. They were part of that family here. That Sally's father, you know, was
That's true.
founder.
Do you remember if Francis was in on the library from the beginning? Was he part of it?
No, because he wasn't in Palm Springs
He hadn't
by
come
then. No, this was in the 20s, you see, and I think Francis came about 1930.
He came in
didn't
as
he?
manager of the power company.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's talk about that. As a banker, you would have been naturally very interested in the development of utilities. What did the community do in those days for water and electricity and gas and the other things that we take for granted?
Well, of course, we speak first of the power company. The company that Francis
Sierras.
Crocker represented, Southern Sierra,
Southern Sierra.
had their
Power.
outside financing. We had nothing to do with that. They came recognizing the number of meters that would be here and the expansion, and put in good equipment, and we've never had any complaint about power.
When did they come? Do you remember?
Well, certainly they were here when I first arrived,
Were they?
because we had electricity. I can't really tell you when they came. Francis probably would remember.
Well, he wasn't here.
He wasn't here
No.
then. No, he came down from Colorado or somewhere like that. No, I can't tell you, but the water situation is even more interesting, I think, because it had several sources. We had the Whitewater Mutual Water Company, and then we had the Palm Springs Water Company, both of which were worked out with P.T. Stevens and Alva Hicks. And those are still sources of the Desert Water Agency now, plus the wells that are drilled.
Where did they get their water?
Well, up in Chino Canyon was one of the sources. Certainly the Whitewater, naturally, which was used largely for irrigation water, came all the way across from Whitewater. But Chino Canyon had quite a little water flow, and that was the domestic water until later on more was needed and wells were drilled.
We have heard the stories about Judge McManus and his,
Judge McCallum.
McCallum, his ditch all the way from Whitewater. Was that still carrying water to the community when you came?
The ditch that you're talking about? Not all the way, no. I've been along and looked at a ditch up there, and I know there was, in those days, they built a little sort of a cement side and stone to carry water down in the open. I think some of that may have been up in Chino too, but then it was distributed soon into a large pipeline.
P.T. Stevens.
You have to be up in there to get pressure.
P.T. Stevens had quite a bit
P.T.
to do
Stevens,
bringing
yes, I
water
mentioned
across
P.T.
the
Stevens.
desert.
That was
Yeah.
Sally's father, P.T. Stevens, and he certainly was involved.
He would have been a very important.
And Alvy Hicks acquired his properties.
Did they, did the community depend too on wells in those days? Did people drill wells of their own at all?
Not too many individuals did.
One of the first wells was out at Deep Well.
Yeah, the wells were drilled, there's no question about that. The Desert Museum had wells, Desert Museum, the Desert Inn had wells. The deepest well was Deep Well Guest Ranch, 613
Before
feet.
it was a guest ranch,
Yeah.
it was privately drilled.
Yeah. And then there were wells that later on were drilled by the company.
I see.
But individuals did, and the various hotels and apartment houses.
Were you involved at all in the establishment of that first water agency?
No.
Water company? Or
No,
was that just...
just glad to see it functioning. I knew the people well and admired them, and we were fortunate to have them involved.
Let's talk about the hotel business in those early days. Palm Springs was always a resort, I guess, wasn't it?
Always a resort, yes.
Right from the beginning. The Desert Inn, would that have been the first hotel?
Yes, yes. Let me say that there may have been something that up near the Palm Springs Hotel, the Foldices up in there, they may have a small sort of a rooming type of thing. La Palma or something like that. There was another one in that block. But the major hotels started with the Desert Inn, and then in 1927 El Mirador, and then there was Del Tocquitz. The Oasis came along there, and that was built right on the McManus property. The
original McCallum property.
well, we can think of it both ways, and have expanded quite a bit. The original Oasis was facing right on Palm Canyon Drive, and now you know it's a block over.
That's true.
And they've expanded quite a bit. Very attractive.
Were you ever in the hotel or resort business?
Through the Deep Well Guest Ranch, which was an operation that was like a hotel, only we had our own horses and we had provided our own entertainment and had considerable property for open activity. I was the purchaser of that at one time and associated with the manager who later obtained part interest in it. They were very well known, Frank and Melba Bennett, and they were outstanding in the things they could do in the community.
I see. Do you remember an organization that we've heard mentioned called the Big Five Hotels, or a hotel association of some sort?
Well, I think there may have been considered, and that would be El Mirador, Desert Inn, Oasis, Del Tocquitz. I don't have the reach for the other one. I think they were inclined to be together, but not always in agreement.
I'm sure that was true. I wondered if there would have been any association to encourage tourism, perhaps sponsored by the hotel.
There was a branch of the Chamber of Commerce called Palm Springs Associates. We got started, I think, if you remember the name of...
Warren.
No, we're not talking about Warren Peniel. His name should come in now. I'm talking about the chap who wrote Palm Springs, I Love You, the English chap.
Burke, Tony Burke.
Tony Burke. Anthony Burke came down. He was an Englishman who came over. We all got to know him very well, but his business was developing attractions for Palm Springs, and we had a Palm Springs Associates separated from the Chamber of Commerce because the Chamber of Commerce was too much controlled by residents who didn't want to expand the town. So the Associates was another organization, and they were involved in raising money, spending money, and then Tony became a great photographer, as you've seen his books, of course. And then he was associated with El Mirador and Warren Penny and the people who were there. One of the early people there was P.T. Stevens in that development. But beyond that, there was no other organization. There have been recently, of course.
So there were people around who really didn't want to see the town get any bigger.
Yes, I say the homeowners were very pleased with the quiet community.
They must have had their own organization at times along the way.
Well, it grew too widely separated to have a representative of all the homeowners. you'll find that homeowners were more likely to be associated within their immediate neighborhood. And I didn't notice something of that sort, although they were also interested in electing people to the city council who had an interest in the development of the residential area. They were strong in support of certain candidates.
How did you bring people to the desert? What kinds of transportation were available to tourists?
Well, our first
visitors?
experience was railroad trains, of course. I can recall we'd meet people both at the Palm Springs station and in Indio, and then they would come in various types of transportation. The daily service of Southern Pacific and Golden State through here came from Chicago as well as Los Angeles, and a lot of people arrived by train.
And New Orleans.
Southern Pacific.
Mm-hmm. When did the railroad go through? Do you remember? That would have been before your arrival.
Yes, that dates way back to the period where the Southern Pacific got every other section to go put a right-of-way through here. I won't even guess the date, but way before we came.
Mm-hmm. Did they still have stagecoach service when you came, or had that been discontinued?
No, I've seen a stagecoach, but no regular service.
Mm-hmm. But so there wouldn't have been any station here at that time?
No. I don't know when the Greyhound first started or when they had something like that. But the railroads were very successful in transporting many people here. Of course, they began to arrive in old cars at the time we came. I came by car.
Do you remember the branch railroad that ran from Garnet Hill down to Palm Springs?
I only knew of it existing. I saw some of the tracks.
Railroad ties
I
we
don't know.
saw.
And railroad ties.
I understand Cornelia White's house was made of railroad ties.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. They came in and ran across more over toward
Toward Smoke Tree.
Smoke Tree Ranch over in there.
What did you folks do for fun in those days?
For fun?
Hmm?
We had a lot of good friends. You asked me to name some of them, and I did. I mean, like Stephen Willard and Carl Lincoln and
The Cokers.
Cokers, whom I mentioned
The
first,
Hicks.
and the Kaufmans and so
Senior
on.
Hicks.
And we'd have parties in homes and things of that sort. But we also, and this is something we certainly shouldn't overlook, we started an organization called the Desert Riders. And I was one of the early people involved in that. And we'd go out, I think, about once a week and have a breakfast out somewhere. And those who didn't want to ride, like Dorothy, would come out in a buggy.
I found a two-wheeled cart in one of the stables, and
But
I felt
those
pretty
experiences,
secure with that.
We would have food served, and we'd have guests, and we'd be way out on the way up toward Palm Canyon or various locations.
Well, I think the riders have gone out for breakfast, don't they still?
There's still a Desert Riders, I think.
There is still a Desert Riders, and they
And
still
then
ride.
they started doing a trail back at the Desert Inn and up high there.
That's right. They were responsible for expanding trails up into the hills, the mountains.
Was there any sort of nightclub activity available to you? Dancing, for example, or that sort of thing?
Well, I don't know that I'm able to focus on that.
After El
The
Mirador
Dunes was a nightclub.
Yes. After El Mirador Hotel came in, they always had a New Year's Eve party.
Oh.
Dance.
We've heard stories about the opening night party at El Mirador Hotel. Were the two of you there?
I think we were.
Very likely. I don't remember it.
Probable. How about restaurants? Did you have good restaurants in those days?
The
I remember the
hotels.
Dollhouse more than any other place. We liked to go there.
They've told us that the dollhouse, that there was a dollhouse before the one up on North Palm Canyon where Sorrentino's is now. There was another dollhouse
It's,
down in the center of town.
yeah,
That was the one I'm talking about. Two rather attractive young women ran it.
Mhm.
However, I don't recall. We could always go and eat at the Oasis, or we could eat at the Desert Inn.
Mhm.
And later on, there was the Chi-Chi. Did you ever hear of the Chi-Chi?
oh yes, I'm sure they have.
Used to go there.
They tried to have music there.
Mhm. Let's talk about gambling again. Did gambling become a serious concern for the community at any point?
Definitely.
Where you were really worried about the influence?
Definitely.
You mentioned Al Wertheimer and the fact that he had said he'd go out of business if you ever told him you wanted him to. Did the community ever say, we want you to go out of business?
We did. And
What
he
happened?
refused. He refused. He told us one of the reasons because he'd sold part of his business to some people in Hollywood. But he said also he refused because he controlled our county law enforcement agency and we couldn't stop him.
Was that true?
No. It was true as far as the county was concerned. We went to Sacramento and got the enforcement down from there and closed him up.
I see. How many places were operated as gambling?
A great many. I'm glad you asked that question. One very well known was the 139 Club, Earl Saucer, in the center of Cathedral City. Another one where you have the Elks Club now was opening up. That man came from the Dunes organization. There were the three rather central gambling locations. Then they began to prop up all over the Indian reservation, slot machines and things like that, so that there could be no attempt. And the city did try to close up some of those places, and we just couldn't accomplish it because the county had given them an opportunity to go ahead. Because of the corruption that came out of the Dunes, all of these other places were protected.
Where was the Dunes itself located?
Well, outside of Cathedral City, about a half a mile, a beautiful location, a
To the
beautiful
north.
building.
Was it anywhere near Date Palm?
What is that cross street?
Well, yes, I
Street
could
is
have
still
been
there.
off of Date Palm, and there had been some palm planting in the area where they built a most attractive nightclub and had a delightful trio for dancing.
So you went to Sacramento to try to get help, and I guess the help was forthcoming at that level. But
Earl Warren was Attorney General.
Earl Warren was Attorney General. When would that have been about? How late did these clubs?
I can't put a date on that, but it was in the late 30s, I would say.
I see. And Riverside County actually would not help you at that time.
Well, it was a most unfortunate situation. The sheriff himself was not corrupted, but some of his men were. And I can tell you the experiences involved. We would go in there and see the district attorney and say, we've come to the time when we'd rather have that closed because it's spreading all out and it's ruining the town. And so they would say, well, we'll go down. We haven't heard there's gambling down there. And they would send, from the sheriff's office, they would telephone down and talk to Earl or Al Wertheimer. We'd like to come down tomorrow afternoon. Will you be there at 3 o'clock? And they would come down, and he would make them welcome, and he'd show them all through, but not open the door going into the casino. You see, you could go into the Dunes, and you could get a nice dining room situation, the dancing, the music, but you had to go through a big double door to get into the casino, and they were not welcome in there, so they'd go in and out and all, and go and leave and say, we didn't find any gambling. That happened frequently.
Did you ever try your luck there?
I never gambled there, but I was in the casino. I know what it looked like.
Culver said that it was a popular place to go for dancing for people down
Oh,
there.
that trio was wonderful. Great rhythm.
But he said generally the club owners discouraged local people from gambling.
He said he would do that, but it didn't happen that way.
So he had a real concern. Phil, I know another very strong interest of you and of Mrs. Boyd has been the preservation of the natural beauty of the desert and the preservation of its resources. Was this always a special interest of yours?
I think, as I said in some of my earlier remarks, it began with my satisfaction with horseback riding with other people, and some of them were interested in the natural areas. And we would get off the horses and walk back up in the canyons. It began then, and it increased during the following years as I moved down into this area particularly.
We're going to stray outside Palm Springs. Palm Springs is probably the subject of these conversations, but we're going to stray a little away now and ask you about the
Should you
founding
put
of the
that
Living
on
Desert.
for your voice to go out?
Gee, is it? No, I'm fine. I have a loud voice. But I want to ask you just a little about a very important institution here in the desert called the Living Desert, which I understand you were very involved in.
It became of great interest to us. You see, we had a ranch called Deep Canyon Ranch, which is located, or was, the area where the Vintage Country Club now is. And adjoining that was quite a natural area between there and these mountains. We used to go over there frequently and recognize the unusual plant life and animal life and bird life, and hoped it could be protected and saved. That was the beginning of it. That would be way back in the 60s. We used this ranch not continually. We had a ranch house there, but we then were living in Riverside, coming back and forth. And it was a natural area that appealed to us, and then we had great fear it was going to be destroyed, because there was evidence of people dumping rubbish over there and cutting out the cactus and moving it into their own gardens and so on. So to make that secure was the first move toward starting the Living Desert.
I see. And I know you were very actively involved in that. There's another thing I'd like you to clear up, because it still confuses people, and we hear it talked about every now and then. There was another person who was very politically active in Palm Springs in those years, named Florian Boyd. And I wondered if there was any association between you, if there was.
Well, there's no relationship, but Florian and I were good friends. We were frequently together. I didn't know Giller as much, although I was familiar with his law firm.
You were not part of the same family?
No, not part of the same family at all.
But he became very active in the town politics too.
Yes, yes. I think he was on city council and mayor for a short period, wasn't
he? He became mayor?
Yeah. No, Florian, he was a public accountant, wasn't he, a CPA?
Yes, I believe.
I think he was. I know he developed one building there too. But Florian was not related to us. We were just good friends.
And that's true. How about one of the early development of one of the most popular activities in the desert, golfing? We've heard it said that the El Mirador Golf Course was the first one down here.
Very first one was out near Culver Nichols. They put in a few holes out there, and we used to go out. But Tom O'Donnell was the one who acquired that land, which was being misused, and he liked to play golf, as everybody knows. And then after he put the 9 holes in, he liked to have his friends come and play, but then he would let us know that it didn't mean that we could bring other friends, our friends, in to play, but anytime we wanted to play, that was fine and dandy, so we enjoyed that course very much.
It was kind of exclusive.
And it's wonderful that it's still being so appreciated and is so popular.
Phil, are there any other memories you have of those days that you think would be interesting to people that you'd like to talk about?
I don't bring them out very quickly. We had a great satisfaction of being involved with the community as it grew and made many lasting friends. You mentioned John Porter Clark. We knew him quite well, and he and Stu Williams were part of a good many of the attractive designs in the area. We made a lot of friends out at Deepwell Guest Ranch. These were Eastern people who came out, so we made friends through those connections back in Detroit and other places. We also had some very interesting contacts over at Smoke Tree. We like that kind of life, the guest ranch.
They call them dude
won't use the word dude ranch, although it's similar because we did have horseback riding and so on.
And you got along in those days without any television, without any radio.
Yes, I remember when the first radios came along. That's true, but we had plenty of reading material, and we enjoyed life.
When did the first telephone service come to town?
I can only remember we had to go across the street to use the phone for a while over at Lickens there. And then that
From the Desert Inn that was, but
yeah.
When we built our home in 26, we had telephones.
That's right. This is a period when the phones came in. But the communication for a while was just between Palm Springs and the railroad station. And then they used the railroad facilities to go beyond that. That was in the very early days. We never had phone problems because as soon as we built a home, we had a phone service.
Peg Wallace has talked with us, and she said that for electricity and gas at their home, which I guess they built in 1919, they had a pressurized kind of system out in the yard with a dome that would sink down and keep pressure on the gas to keep it coming inside. Then they had a generator in the garage to provide electric power. Was this common down here?
I'm not familiar with it.
You didn't do
No,
that?
we didn't
No.
use that.
We knew that family, but didn't realize they were doing all that.
Where was your first home built?
We built, and the first year that we came back after we finished the house and had moved in, we had El Mirador in our side yard with no thought when we built that there would ever be a hotel that close. But it really, we were
We were just south of El Mirador on Alameda. The house is still there.
actually, our house was due south of the swimming pool itself, but our living room faced toward toward San Gorgonio, which then included, after they built El Mirador, the tower. So we would see the tower at night lighted, and the tower in the daytime with the sunlight on it.
You must have had the vision to see what would happen down here at least a little bit. You became very involved in land development at times, didn't you?
There were spots where we had a particular interest. For example, Deepwell Guest Ranch was when the town developed all around it, and we couldn't really continue as a guest ranch. We had over 100 acres in there, so we reduced the Deep Well down to sort of a little hotel operation, and the rest of it was divided up for subdivisions. And we were involved in preparing that plan and selling off to various developers. Then we had an experience down here with 2-3 subdivisions which exist here.
Well, you had a vegetable ranch too that's now,
Yeah, but we didn't do any
Thunderbird.
land development there. We owned the land where Thunderbird Country Club is. We called it the Red Roof Ranch, and we were farmers there. We grew tomatoes and strawberries.
thanks to Japanese help.
Thunderbird was a vegetable ranch.
Yeah.
That's marvelous.
So we gradually came down here by steps from Deep Well Ranch, Red Roof Ranch, and Deep Canyon Ranch.
But we
Now we're
never
up where we're
lived
going to be.
at Deep Well, and we never lived at Red Roof. They were all outside activity for this one.
Well, that was quite an experience there where you know Thunderbird is now, and it was an unfortunate one because the war came along, and the Japanese, who we were very fond of, who did all our growing, I did the marketing. He was forced to go over with all the Japanese over into Arizona, you know. They couldn't stay. That just left me with a few Mexicans who didn't know how to grow things, so we closed up the place and sold it.
And now look what's happened.
Yeah.
But that's mighty nice golf course. I'm very glad it became golf course.
Has some of our trees over there still.
Yes.
In those early years, were there very many film stars who came to Palm Springs?
I think you'll discover most of them in the El Mirador area. There were, and Tony Burke's book illustrates them. And you can see them around the swimming pool and so on. There were known to be several movies made down here. Rudolph Valentino made one. I can't tell you the name of it. But I remember there at the Desert Inn, there were several occasions where a motion picture group were there.
Probably the most famous film ever made here was Lost Horizon,
Probably was.
which they made up in Talcotts Canyon, I think. How about the opening of private clubs? And I'm thinking here particularly of the tennis club and the racket club. Do you remember much about that?
Of course, we knew Charlie Farrell very well and Ralph Bellamy, and have known Charlie for years, and we were early members that went to the racket club frequently, and they had a lot of motion picture following. Tennis club was quite different from that. It didn't have the motion picture people that I can recall.
But it had great charm.
I'm sure.
Yes, a nice view and pleasant associations, good food.
That was built by Pearl McManus.
Yes.
What sort of person was she?
Well, I think we recognize that Pearl McManus is a rather remarkable person. I'm close enough associated with all that she's done for the whole valley to respect her generosity in wanting to preserve the natural things in the desert. I knew her best because for a while I was associated with her husband, Austin, who was on the city council. And then they lived right across the street, so I was associated with her in a number of little things we discussed frequently. I was fond of her. I think we were good friends.
We have spoken of the women of those early days with a lot of respect because they must have been very strong people. And they assumed, 3 of them assumed powerful leadership roles in the community. And I think of Zadie Bunker and Nellie Kaufman and Pearl McManus. And those three women really were instrumental in the development of the community.
They had a lot to do with it. No question about that.
They were. Is there anything you'd like to add to what we've talked about? Anything we forgot to?
We haven't
We'll
touched
think of that
upon,
after you leave.
upon the White sisters,
Florella and Cornelia.
and Cornelia, and Smeaton Chase's wife. Smeaton Chase's wife.
Yes, she was
one
the
of
third sister
original
of the
White sisters.
he was an Englishman, wasn't he, Smeaton Chase?
Yes.
Did you ever read some of his books? He's written some books about the desert. There's our Araby, and there's another one.
Colorado Desert Trails.
Yes.
Were the White sisters actively involved in community affairs?
Oh, yes.
Well, they weren't aggressive. They were just very much a part of everything, and everybody liked them, and they were rather exceptional. Miss Cornelia was always wore trousers.
She was on the school board.
She
I know I followed her on the school board. I remember when they came up to ask me if I would serve, because she was retiring.
You were both friends of Raymond Cree, I believe.
Quite. You'll find in that article that I gave you to read about the tribute I paid to him at the Lions Club some evidence of that.
Did you participate actively yourselves in the creation of the first school here?
I didn't. Dorothy had
No, there
something
was a
more.
school and a school board, and it was the
Of
school
course,
board
we all knew
I
Catherine
went on.
Finchy, and when she came down, and did all we could whenever we could to be assistants to her.
The first school, local school here, would that have been Catherine Finchy, the school?
She came down and was the first teacher, wasn't she? The first school teacher.
I'm sorry, not Catherine.
And the Stevens gave the property for that first
I
major
think of Francis
building.
Stevens School.
Yeah.
And that was the first completely integrated school by itself.
That's
As I
right.
recall.
What did people here do for their children prior to that?
Well, there weren't very many children, and
There weren't.
Catherine Finchy was in the one-room school, and until the Francis Stevens School was built.
I don't
That was
remember
all there
seeing many
was.
children around the Desert Inn. I don't think that
Well, there have
people.
been Betty Kiley.
Well, she wasn't born yet,
She wasn't born yet, that's right.
because I remember before she was born.
One of the young folks.
I think there were a couple of children, at least in one of the Roberson family too, that we knew there.
Well, thank you for sharing your morning with us. It's been a delightful
I'll get a lot of
experience.
good ideas as soon as you're.
Oh, I'm sure you will.
Right.
So will I.
But take along what I gave you. They're extra copies, and it'll probably bore you to try to put that all together. But recognize my last effort to talk about the early days was the opportunity I had to speak to the University Club, and I got into trouble on that. Those are just a men's organization. They went home and told their wives about it, and they called me, and several different women's clubs wanted me to give the same talk. So I haven't repeated it.
This has been a conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Philip Boyd. Phil was the first mayor of Palm Springs, and he's told us a great deal about those early days. And this has been another Prickly Pears presentation.